The Warsaw Pact invasion of Hungary in 1956 did not erupt suddenly from chaos in the streets of Budapest, but emerged from years of accumulated pressure inside a post-war system that had been imposed by force, maintained by fear, and justified by ideology, as Hungary became one of the earliest and most dangerous tests of whether the Soviet Union would tolerate genuine political autonomy within its sphere of control, because after the Second World War, Hungary found itself absorbed into the Eastern Bloc through a combination of Red Army occupation, manipulated elections, and the gradual elimination of opposition, a process that culminated in the establishment of a Stalinist regime under Matyas Rákosi that ruled through surveillance, purges, and economic coercion while claiming to act in the name of socialism. This regime imposed rapid collectivization, heavy industrialization, and political repression on a society still recovering from wartime devastation, producing shortages, resentment, and a pervasive climate of fear enforced by the secret police. While dissent was framed as counter-revolutionary sabotage rather than political disagreement, for years, Hungarian society absorbed these pressures in silence, constrained by the memory of wartime destruction and the overwhelming presence of Soviet power. Yet beneath the surface, frustration grew as living standards declined and national sovereignty appeared reduced to a fiction. The death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 cracked this rigid system, introducing uncertainty across the Eastern Bloc as Soviet leadership began cautiously reassessing the costs of repression and the risks of unrest, a shift that opened limited space for debate while raising expectations among populations that had endured years of ideological rigidity. In Hungary, this moment produced the brief rise of Imre Nagy, a reform-minded communist who sought to soften the system through economic adjustments, reduced police terror, and limited political openness, policies that resonated deeply with a population desperate for relief, but alarmed hardliners who feared loss of control. Nagy's removal in 1955 signaled the resilience of conservative forces within the party, yet the reformist impulse could not be fully extinguished, as de-Stalinization gathered momentum across the bloc following Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech in early 1956, which denounced Stalin's crimes and shattered the myth of infallible leadership. This speech reverberated through Eastern Europe like an earthquake, legitimizing criticism that had previously been unspeakable and encouraging intellectuals, students, and workers to articulate grievances that had long been suppressed. In Hungary, these currents converged with national memory of independence and resentment toward foreign domination, transforming abstract reform debates into demands for sovereignty, pluralism, and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. The immediate spark came in October 1956, when Hungarian students organized demonstrations inspired in part by events in Poland, where unrest had forced concessions from Moscow, creating the impression that pressure could yield results without provoking violent repression. On October 23rd, a peaceful protest in Budapest quickly swelled into a mass movement as crowds demanded political reform, freedom of expression, and the return of Imre Nagy, while symbols of Stalinist authority were attacked and the facade of control collapsed with astonishing speed. The regime's attempt to suppress the demonstrations through force backfired catastrophically, as shots fired by security forces transformed protest into revolt, and armed resistance spread through the city, drawing in workers, soldiers, and ordinary citizens who seized weapons and erected barricades. Within hours, Hungary had crossed a threshold from reformist agitation to full-scale uprising, confronting the Soviet Union with a crisis that tested the limits of its post-war order. Moscow's initial response was confused and divided, as Soviet leaders weighed competing imperatives: the desire to preserve control against the fear that violent intervention could provoke international backlash or inspire unrest across the bloc. Early Soviet troop movements into Budapest were tentative, and negotiations with Nagy suggested the possibility of compromise, reinforcing hopes that Hungary might achieve a degree of autonomy within socialism. Nagy, reinstated as prime minister, moved rapidly to legitimize the revolution by announcing political reforms, dissolving the secret police, and promising free elections, steps that reflected both genuine conviction and the necessity of channeling popular energy into a constitutional framework. As revolutionary councils formed and fighting continued, Hungary appeared to be slipping out of Soviet control, a development that alarmed hardliners who feared a domino effect across Eastern Europe. The most consequential moment came when Nagy declared Hungary's neutrality and announced withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact, a step that transformed a domestic uprising into a direct challenge to the Soviet security system because it threatened to puncture the buffer zone that Moscow regarded as essential to its defense against the West. For Soviet leaders, this crossed an existential line, reframing the crisis from a question of reform to one of strategic survival, particularly as the Cold War environment remained tense and mistrust of Western intentions ran deep. The coincidence of the Hungarian uprising with the Suez Crisis further complicated calculations, as Western powers were distracted and divided, reinforcing Soviet confidence that decisive action could be taken without immediate military response. Behind closed doors, Moscow resolved that allowing Hungary to leave the socialist camp would undermine the entire Eastern Bloc, signaling weakness and inviting further defections, a risk judged unacceptable regardless of cost. The decision to intervene militarily was thus framed not as a choice, but as a necessity imposed by the logic of Cold War geopolitics, even as it contradicted the rhetoric of peaceful coexistence and self-determination. In early November 1956, massive Soviet forces moved to crush the revolution, launching a coordinated assault on Budapest and other cities with tanks, artillery, and overwhelming firepower, transforming hope into catastrophe. As resistance fighters, outmatched and isolated, fought desperately against an army determined to reassert control. The invasion was brutal and decisive. As urban neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, thousands were killed, and the revolutionary government was dismantled, with Nagy seeking asylum before being arrested, deported, and eventually executed. The speed and scale of the intervention demonstrated the limits of reform within the Soviet system and sent an unmistakable message across Eastern Europe that challenges to the strategic foundations of the bloc would be met with force regardless of popular support or moral legitimacy. Internationally, the invasion exposed the harsh reality of Cold War power politics, as condemnation from the West remained rhetorical and constrained by competing crises, reinforcing the perception that Eastern Europe lay beyond effective external protection. For Hungary, the consequences were devastating and long-lasting, as the brief moment of freedom was extinguished and replaced by a reimposed regime that combined repression with cautious reform, embedding trauma into national memory and shaping attitudes toward authority for generations. The Warsaw Pact invasion of Hungary thus stands as one of the earliest and clearest demonstrations that the Cold War was not merely a standoff between superpowers, but a system enforced through violence on societies caught within its boundaries, revealing how aspirations for sovereignty and democracy could collide with the strategic imperatives of an empire unwilling to risk fragmentation. In the immediate aftermath of the invasion, Hungary entered a grim and disorienting period in which the scale of defeat became clear only gradually as the hopes raised during the days of uprising were replaced by the realities of occupation, repression, and political reconstruction under Soviet supervision. Because although organized resistance was crushed within days, the social and psychological impact of the intervention reverberated far longer than the fighting itself. Soviet forces secured key cities, communication hubs, and transport routes with overwhelming force, dismantling remaining pockets of resistance and arresting leaders at geeks of revolutionary councils, while makeshift militias were hunted down and disarmed, their members facing imprisonment or execution, a process that signaled unmistakably that compromise had given way to total control. The installation of János Kadar as head of a new pro-Soviet government marked the formal restoration of authority, yet his legitimacy rested not on popular consent, but on the presence of Soviet tanks, a reality that shaped every aspect of his rule in its early phase. Kadar justified the invasion as a defense against counter-revolution and foreign manipulation, adopting the language of Cold War orthodoxy to frame repression as necessity, even as much of the population viewed his government as imposed and illegitimate. Mass arrests followed, as security services were rebuilt and expanded with Soviet assistance, targeting former revolutionaries, intellectuals, students, and workers who had participated in the uprising or expressed sympathy for reform, creating a climate of fear that aimed to extinguish dissent before it could reorganize. Trials were conducted behind closed doors, sentences were harsh, and executions were carried out to demonstrate the consequences of defiance, reinforcing the lesson that the limits of permissible change had been brutally reasserted. Among the most consequential acts of retribution was the eventual trial and execution of Imre Nagy, whose fate symbolized the Soviet determination to erase the legitimacy of the uprising by eliminating its most visible representative, even as his memory became a rallying point for future dissent. The repression was accompanied by a wave of emigration, as nearly 200,000 Hungarians fled across newly permeable borders into Austria and beyond, creating one of the largest refugee movements in post-war Europe and exposing the human cost of enforcing bloc discipline. This exodus not only deprived Hungary of a generation of skilled citizens, but also served as a visible indictment of the system, as images of refugees challenged official narratives of liberation and stability. Internationally, the invasion provoked widespread condemnation, particularly in the West, where public opinion was shocked by the brutality of Soviet action. Yet this outrage translated into little more than diplomatic protest, constrained by the realities of Cold War power balance and the simultaneous crisis unfolding in the Middle East. The United Nations debated the issue, but resolutions carried no enforcement mechanism, reinforcing the understanding that Eastern Europe remained firmly within the Soviet sphere, and that moral condemnation alone could not alter strategic realities. This gap between rhetoric and action left a deep impression on Hungarians and other Eastern Europeans, confirming that appeals to international norms offered little protection against force, and that liberation would have to come from internal change rather than external rescue. Within the Soviet bloc, the invasion served as a cautionary tale, deterring overt challenges while prompting more subtle forms of resistance, as populations learned to navigate the system through compliance, quiet dissent, or withdrawal rather than open revolt. Moscow, for its part, drew its own lessons, recognizing that repression carried costs and that long-term stability required a balance between control and accommodation, an insight that would shape policy in the years to come. Under Kadar, Hungary gradually moved away from the most brutal forms of Stalinist repression toward a model that combined political loyalty with limited economic reform, a strategy aimed at securing passive consent rather than ideological fervor. This approach, later known as goulash communism, sought to improve living standards in exchange for political quiescence, reflecting an attempt to neutralize the memory of 1956 by addressing some of the grievances that had fueled the uprising without conceding sovereignty or pluralism. Yet, beneath this pragmatic adjustment, the trauma of invasion remained unresolved, shaping national consciousness and reinforcing a sense of betrayal that would resurface decades later. The Warsaw Pact invasion of Hungary thus reshaped not only Hungarian society, but the internal dynamics of the Eastern Bloc, establishing a precedent that reform could be tolerated only within strict boundaries defined by Moscow, and that deviation from strategic alignment would be met with overwhelming force. This precedent would echo in later crises, influencing both the calculations of reformers and the reflexes of the Soviet leadership as it confronted future challenges to its authority. In retrospect, the invasion marked a critical moment when the promise of post-Stalin liberalization collided with the imperatives of empire, revealing that the Cold War's ideological flexibility had hard limits enforced by tanks rather than treaties. The aftermath of 1956 demonstrated that while repression could restore order, it could not erase memory, and that the suppression of one uprising planted the seeds of future transformation by exposing the true nature of power within the Soviet system. The broader significance of the 1956 Hungarian invasion became clearer as the Cold War progressed, because the events in Budapest reshaped how both sides understood the boundaries of power, reform, and legitimacy in a divided Europe, revealing that the Soviet bloc was held together not by shared conviction, but by the credible threat of force, and that any deviation from strategic alignment would be treated as a systemic danger rather than a domestic choice. For the Soviet leadership, the decision to crush the Hungarian Revolution was traumatic and controversial, exposing internal divisions and moral unease, even as it reaffirmed control, because while intervention preserved the integrity of the Eastern Bloc, it also shattered claims that socialism in Eastern Europe rested on popular consent, replacing ideological legitimacy with coercive stability. Nikita Khrushchev, who had denounced Stalin's crimes only months earlier, now found himself presiding over a massacre that contradicted his rhetoric of reform and peaceful coexistence, a contradiction that haunted Soviet policy and eroded credibility both at home and abroad. Within the communist world, the invasion provoked disillusionment among intellectuals, artists, and party members who had believed de-Stalinization would open space for genuine change, leading to resignations, quiet dissent, and a long-term erosion of faith in the moral authority of the Soviet project. This ideological damage was particularly acute in Western Europe, where communist parties struggled to reconcile loyalty to Moscow with outrage over Hungary, weakening their appeal and altering the political landscape in ways that benefited non-communist left movements. The invasion also clarified the strategic doctrine that would later be formalized as the Brezhnev Doctrine, the principle that the sovereignty of socialist states was subordinate to the interests of the socialist system as a whole, a concept implicitly applied in 1956 and later invoked to justify interventions elsewhere. For Eastern European societies, Hungary became a reference point that shaped behavior for decades, instilling caution among reformers who learned that demands for neutrality or exit from the Warsaw Pact would provoke intervention, while encouraging more limited, incremental strategies that sought change within boundaries rather than confrontation. This lesson was evident in subsequent crises, such as the Prague Spring of 1968, where reformers attempted to avoid the Hungarian precedent yet ultimately encountered the same limits, demonstrating the durability of the doctrine established in 1956. The invasion also influenced Western strategy, reinforcing acceptance of the post-war division of Europe and discouraging direct challenges to Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe, as policymakers recognized that rhetorical support for liberation could not be matched by military action without risking nuclear war. This acceptance, though rarely acknowledged publicly, shaped Cold War stability by implicitly recognizing spheres of influence, even as it left millions under authoritarian rule. The Hungarian case thus illuminated the tragic trade-offs of the Cold War order, in which preventing global catastrophe required tolerating local injustice, a compromise that haunted Western rhetoric about freedom and self-determination. The human consequences of this compromise were visible in Hungary's refugee crisis, political repression, and long-term psychological scars, which underscored that Cold War stability was purchased at the expense of individual lives and aspirations. Over time, the memory of 1956 became a subterranean force within Hungarian society, shaping cultural expression, private discourse, and attitudes toward authority, even as public commemoration was suppressed or distorted by the regime. This memory sustained a quiet continuity of resistance that would resurface decades later when the Soviet system itself began to unravel. In this sense, the invasion did not extinguish the desire for autonomy, but forced it underground, delaying transformation while intensifying its eventual impact. The Warsaw Pact invasion of Hungary thus stands as a foundational moment in Cold War history, demonstrating how power was enforced within the bloc and how reform was constrained by geopolitical logic, while also revealing the long-term costs of repression for legitimacy and cohesion. It exposed the gap between ideological promise and political reality, a gap that widened over time and contributed to the eventual collapse of the system that had relied on force to preserve unity. By crushing one uprising, the Soviet Union secured short-term stability, but sowed seeds of doubt that would erode loyalty and credibility, illustrating how violence could solve immediate problems while creating deeper ones that no amount of control could fully contain. As decades passed, the legacy of the 1956 invasion continued to shape both Hungarian society and the internal logic of the Cold War, because the events in Budapest became embedded not only in national memory, but in the operational assumptions of power, teaching rulers and ruled alike that the limits of permissible change were enforced not by law or ideology, but by force, backed by an unforgiving strategic calculus. Within Hungary, the Kadar regime's gradual shift toward relative economic liberalization and social accommodation did not erase the trauma of invasion, but sought to manage it by trading material stability for political silence, creating a tacit social contract that reduced overt repression while preserving the monopoly of power, an arrangement that produced a surface appearance of calm but rested on the unspoken knowledge of how violently dissent had been crushed. This strategy succeeded in dampening resistance for a time, yet it also hollowed out ideological commitment, replacing belief with compliance, and fostering a culture of cynicism that would later undermine the system from within. Across Eastern Europe, Hungary's fate functioned as both warning and lesson, shaping how reformers calibrated their ambitions and how ordinary citizens navigated authoritarian rule, reinforcing patterns of self-censorship, adaptation, and quiet dissent rather than open rebellion. The memory of 1956 circulated through whispered conversations, samizdat literature, and exile communities, preserving an alternative narrative that contradicted official histories and sustained a sense of moral injury that could not be fully suppressed. For the Soviet Union, the invasion's legacy was equally corrosive, because While it demonstrated the effectiveness of military force in maintaining control, it also exposed the fragility of legitimacy within the bloc, compelling Moscow to rely increasingly on coercion and compromise rather than genuine consent. This reliance created a cycle in which each intervention reinforced dependence on force, narrowing options for reform and deepening the contradiction between proclaimed ideals and practiced governance. The psychological impact of Hungary extended into Soviet decision-making, influencing how leaders assessed risk and response in later crises, as the fear of losing control competed with awareness that intervention damaged credibility and provoked long-term instability. This tension would reappear repeatedly, from Czechoslovakia in 1968 to Poland in the early 1980s, as Soviet leaders struggled to reconcile the desire for reform with the imperative of maintaining a strategic buffer zone. Internationally, the invasion of Hungary crystallized a tacit understanding of Cold War boundaries, as Western powers, despite rhetorical condemnation, implicitly accepted Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe in exchange for relative stability, a bargain that underscored the limits of moral diplomacy in a nuclear-armed world. This acceptance shaped the language and practice of détente, reinforcing the idea that peace depended on respecting spheres of influence, even when they violated principles of self-determination, a reality that haunted Western narratives of freedom. The Hungarian uprising also influenced global perceptions of socialism, eroding sympathy among leftist movements and intellectuals who could no longer reconcile the image of liberation with the reality of tanks in city streets, accelerating ideological fragmentation within the global left and weakening Moscow's moral authority. In this sense, the invasion's consequences extended far beyond Eastern Europe, contributing to shifts in political culture that reshaped debates about power, reform, and legitimacy worldwide. Within Hungary, the suppressed memory of 1956 became a reservoir of meaning that resurfaced during moments of crisis and transformation, most notably in the late 1980s, when economic stagnation, political exhaustion, and the loosening grip of Soviet power created conditions for change. When the reburial of Imre Nagy was finally permitted in 1989, it symbolized not only personal rehabilitation, but the collapse of the narrative that had justified repression for decades, marking the moment when the state could no longer contain the truth of its origins. The peaceful dismantling of communist rule in Hungary later that year revealed the long arc of 1956, demonstrating that while force could delay transformation, it could not permanently suppress demands for autonomy and dignity. Retrospectively, the Warsaw Pact invasion of Hungary appears as both an assertion of power and an admission of weakness, a moment when the Soviet system revealed that it lacked the flexibility to accommodate genuine pluralism and therefore relied on violence to preserve order. This reliance ensured short-term survival, but undermined long-term stability, embedding distrust and disillusionment that accumulated until the system itself collapsed. The Hungarian Revolution and its suppression thus occupy a central place in Cold War history, not because they altered borders or alliances, but because they exposed the fundamental mechanics of control within the Eastern Bloc and the human cost of maintaining geopolitical order. They remind us that the Cold War was sustained not only by nuclear deterrence and diplomatic maneuvering, but by the lived experiences of societies whose aspirations were subordinated to strategic imperatives, and that the apparent stability of the post-war order was built on repeated acts of coercion that left deep and lasting scars. In understanding 1956, we see how the Cold War enforced conformity through fear, how reform was constrained by the logic of empire, and how the suppression of one uprising reverberated across decades, shaping behavior memory, and eventual transformation, revealing that even in defeat, the struggle for autonomy left traces that power could not erase. The final phase of understanding the Warsaw Pact invasion of Hungary comes not from the immediate destruction of the uprising, but from recognizing how 1956 redefined the meaning of power, consent, and survival inside the Cold War system. Because the Soviet decision to intervene revealed that the Eastern Bloc was not a voluntary association of socialist states, but a security architecture enforced by violence, in which ideology functioned as justification rather than foundation. Hungary's attempt to assert neutrality and political pluralism exposed the core contradiction of Soviet rule in Eastern Europe, that while socialist legitimacy was claimed on behalf of workers and popular sovereignty, any genuine expression of those principles that threatened strategic control was treated as an existential danger. This contradiction mattered because it stripped the system of moral coherence, replacing belief with fear and compliance, and ensuring that loyalty was maintained not through persuasion, but through the memory of repression. The invasion of 1956 thus became a structural reference point, shaping how all subsequent reform efforts were judged and constrained, as leaders and citizens alike internalized the lesson that autonomy would be tolerated only so long as it did not challenge Moscow's strategic imperatives. The Hungarian case clarified that the Cold War's stability rested on enforced immobility, on frozen political arrangements that suppressed change in the name of preventing catastrophe, a logic that prioritized order over justice and security over freedom. This trade-off defined life for millions in Eastern Europe, whose daily existence was shaped by the unspoken knowledge that power ultimately flowed from tanks and troops rather than ballots or debate. Yet the very act of suppression planted a deeper instability, because systems maintained by fear require constant reinforcement, and the gap between official narratives and lived reality widens over time, eroding credibility and trust. Hungary's experience illustrated how repression could stabilize borders while destabilizing legitimacy, producing regimes that survived but could not, inspire, and societies that complied but did not believe. The Cold War's apparent equilibrium thus concealed a slow accumulation of disillusionment, as each act of coercion reinforced cynicism and undermined the ideological foundations of the bloc. When reform finally became unavoidable decades later, the memory of 1956 shaped the path it took, as leaders sought change without confrontation, and citizens demanded truth without violence, reflecting a learned understanding of the costs of direct challenge. The re-emergence of Hungary as a site of peaceful transition in 1989 cannot be separated from the trauma of 1956, because the restraint displayed by both rulers and protesters was informed by an acute awareness of how easily hope could be crushed by force. In this sense, the invasion's legacy was paradoxical, as the same event that demonstrated the limits of reform also taught future generations how to navigate those limits more effectively. Internationally, the lesson of Hungary continued to inform Cold War practice, reinforcing acceptance of spheres of influence and shaping doctrines that treated intervention as a legitimate tool of system preservation, even as it exposed the moral bankruptcy of such arrangements. The silence of Western powers in the face of the invasion underscored the grim reality that the Cold War order was sustained by mutual restraint at the expense of smaller nations' autonomy, a bargain that reduced global conflict while entrenching local injustice. Hungary's tragedy thus illuminates the human cost of geopolitical stability, revealing that the avoidance of nuclear war often required tolerating repression and sacrifice by those trapped within contested zones. The Warsaw Pact invasion of Hungary stands as one of the Cold War's clearest demonstrations that peace between superpowers did not equate to peace for societies under their control, and that stability at the top was frequently achieved through violence at the periphery. Its enduring significance lies in how it exposed the mechanics of domination within the Eastern Bloc, the limits of reform under empire, and the long-term consequences of ruling through fear rather than consent. In remembering 1956, we confront a central truth of the Cold War, that the system maintained order by suppressing choice, and that while tanks could silence a revolution, they could not erase the memory of resistance or the aspiration for sovereignty, which survived underground until the moment when the structures that enforced obedience finally collapsed. The ultimate legacy of the Warsaw Pact invasion of Hungary in 1956 lies in how it revealed the Cold War as a system that preserved stability through enforced immobility, demonstrating that peace between superpowers was often maintained by denying choice to those caught within their spheres of control, and that the absence of large-scale war concealed a constant, localized violence inflicted in the name of order. Hungary's uprising exposed the gap between ideological rhetoric and political reality, showing that claims of popular sovereignty and socialist solidarity could not survive genuine tests of autonomy, and that, when confronted with demands for neutrality, pluralism, and self-determination, the Soviet system responded not with negotiation, but with overwhelming force. The intervention clarified that the Eastern Bloc's cohesion depended not on shared belief, but on the credible threat of repression, embedding fear into governance, and ensuring compliance at the cost of legitimacy. This trade-off had profound consequences, because regimes that rely on coercion may endure but cannot inspire, creating societies marked by cynicism, resignation, and suppressed memory rather than genuine allegiance. The Hungarian case became a foundational reference for both rulers and ruled, shaping strategies of control and resistance across Eastern Europe for decades. As leaders learned to manage dissent through accommodation and intimidation, and citizens learned to pursue change indirectly rather than through open revolt, the moral cost of this arrangement was immense, as millions lived under systems that demanded silence in exchange for stability, while the international community accepted this reality as the price of avoiding nuclear catastrophe. The silence that greeted Hungary's suppression revealed the limits of moral diplomacy in a bipolar world, underscoring that principles of self-determination were subordinate to strategic calculation when great power interests were at stake. Yet the very clarity of this injustice ensured that 1956 could not be erased, because the memory of tanks in Budapest remained a reference point that undermined official narratives and sustained a quiet continuity of resistance. When the Cold War eventually ended, Hungary's peaceful transition bore the imprint of this history, reflecting a collective determination to avoid violence informed by the knowledge of how brutally it had once been deployed. The invasion thus stands not merely as an episode of repression, but as a structural lesson about power and order, illustrating how global stability can be constructed on local suffering, and how systems that suppress autonomy in the name of security ultimately weaken themselves by eroding legitimacy. In understanding the Warsaw Pact invasion of Hungary, we see the Cold War stripped of abstraction, revealed as a lived experience in which geopolitical logic translated directly into human cost, and in which the boundaries of permissible politics were enforced by tanks rather than consent. Its enduring warning is that peace maintained through coercion carries hidden debts that accumulate over time, and that the suppression of one generation's aspirations can shape the moral and political landscape of an entire era, leaving scars that outlast the structures that inflicted them.